I'm seeing a lot of headlines saying that the Supreme Court just ended the ban on conversion therapy. This framing is misleading, and the actual story is more complicated and more important than the media is letting on. The case I'm referring to is Chiles versus Salazar. Kaylee Chiles is a licensed counselor in Colorado who argued that the state's ban on conversion therapy violated her First Amendment right to free speech. The court ruled 8-1 in her favor. That's nearly unanimous, including 2 liberal justices. But here's what you're not being told. Right now, in most of the United States, the only clinically approved approach to questions around gender and identity is affirmation. So if a confused young person walks into a therapist's office and says, "I feel like I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," the only sanctioned response is to agree, validate, and proceed from there. If a therapist instead says something like, "Well, trapped in a man's body, that's a philosophical idea, not an emotion. Why don't you walk me through what you mean by feel like a woman?" The therapist can face investigation by their state medical board, fines, or loss of their license. In other words, a therapist making an open-ended, exploratory statement, the most basic tool of the profession, could be grounds for professional discipline. The example I just mentioned isn't hypothetical. Tamara Pitsky was a therapist at one of Washington State's largest hospital systems who left her job after being pressured to affirm all gender dysphoria cases regardless of the patient's history or other mental health conditions. After going public in the free press, she was fired from her next job within a week of the story being published. Washington State then launched a licensing investigation into her, leaving her practicing for over a year not knowing whether the state would take her license, until the case was quietly dropped. So what we have in the talk therapy field is a predetermined, one-size-fits-all response to address an incredibly complex issue with zero flexibility. That's not clinical judgment, that's a script. Most people don't know the medical history of gender and identity-related issues, but it matters. From 1994 to 2013, the DSM categorized this as gender identity disorder, where the pathology was the identity, the disconnect between the way a person labeled themselves and their biological reality. In 2013, the DSM-5 replaced that with gender dysphoria disorder, where the pathology became the dysphoria or the distress itself. That might sound like a subtle semantic shift, but it narrowed the entire clinical conversation to a single permitted response: reduce the distress by affirming the identity. The issue is that when a therapist has only one answer to a presenting concern, they're no longer doing therapy. They're functioning as a mouthpiece for a predetermined conclusion. The counselor at the center of the Colorado case explicitly disavowed the coercive practices associated with old-school conversion therapy. Shock therapy, aversion techniques, deliberate infliction of pain intended to override someone's attractions. Her argument was that the ban made it nearly impossible for parents to find therapists willing to explore gender identity with their kids unless the outcome was affirmation of transition. Justice Kagan, in her concurring opinion, identified exactly why the law failed. Colorado had suppressed one side of the clinical debate while subsidizing the other. Once you do that, she wrote, the constitutional issue becomes straightforward. The term conversion therapy is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this media coverage, and not honestly. The research on conversion therapy harms is real, the elevated suicide risk, the psychological damage, and it matters. But it applies to coercive, aversive practices. Applying those findings to a therapist asking an open-ended question isn't science, it's conflation. Collapsing that distinction, treating clinical inquiry as the equivalent to shock collars, isn't just sloppy. It's a rhetorical move designed to make normal therapeutic practice unspeakable. So why do I care? I work in behavioral health as a licensed clinical mental health counselor. I see large numbers of patients who refer to themselves as transgender. And I can tell you that the current framework creates a genuine clinical problem. It removes the ability to explore. Is the patient's distress coming from internalized homophobia, internalized misogyny, peer contagion, other trauma? All these can present identically in a confused young person sitting across from me. Affirmation treats them all the same. One size fits all is not a standard of care, it's the abandonment of one. That's not therapy, that's a conveyor belt. Therapists are trained to explore, that's the job. This ruling at least gives some of that back.